As America merges more towards a corporate-controlled country, which often is synonymous with fascism, we can take a look and see that potentially trillion-dollar companies and the products they produce are not optimal for the majority of people. We see that CEOs are getting, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 times what regular workers are. Workers are not getting the minimum wage raised. In addition, we also look at some of the products and they're not very good. For example, Windows is a terrible product in my opinion versus the open source solution with Linux. Linux Desktop is something I personally use and find it to be not only free, but better than Windows. And also it has more of a freedom aspect to it. So I'm not getting spied on and I don't constantly have my data sent to some surveillance capitalist company. So in a nutshell, do we think that this is potentially an antidote for this corporate fascism or corporate monopoly that's happening in America and the big tech coup that's also trying to not only take over America, but Canada and Europe? Let's go ahead and dive into some of these details and see if we can tease out, in fact, that this already exists and potentially there's a model. So one place to start with is to look at Noam Chomsky, who is a well-known, left-leaning, libertarian socialist. That one of the things he talks about is this concept of federated or decentralized democratic control of institutions. So it's really important here to talk about the straw man that typically is brought up. So again, we have people who are worth, in excess of $100 billion who have so much wealth they can control the government of the United States. That is obviously not optimal for the majority of people in America. And so the straw man that typically is thrown out is that if you're against that, you're a communist. Well, we can't just have, you're either going to worship a new form of monarchy, which is the ultra wealthy, or you're a communist, right? That doesn't really make sense. As a straw man, let's actually dive into what this means when you say libertarian-socialist. Like, it sounds like a strange, term, but really what it means is that you're anti-bureaucracy. So again, notice how that's not what people are talking about when you talk about left-leaning politics. Is I'm not for bureaucracy. I'm for federation or decentralized control. And you see this with Linux, the way, in fact, not just Linux, but many open source systems are developed, is it's decentralized and federated, and it's also democratically controlled. So again, there's no dictator. In the case of a communist or authoritarian regime or Stasi East Germany, you see that it's centralized control. In fact, the centralized control was from Russia, and they had, authoritarian regimes with a lot of actually tracking that is similar to what's happening currently with big tech. So you could say actually big tech is more similar to Stasi East Germany than libertarian socialism is to, communism. And one of the ways that we can think about how this could be a successful model to counteract big tech is it's already working. We see that open source software in the top 25 languages dominates. There's only a couple examples of closed source. Also, we see that with operating systems, the vast majority of the global infrastructure is on Linux, so 90% plus. We see that based on the Halloween documents, there was a deliberate campaign by the monopoly Microsoft to delegitimize a better product that's free called Linux. We can also see this with other products that are made by tech companies like printer cartridges. I heard this from a recent Cory Doctorow podcast where he was talking about how it's more expensive than, a racehorse semen, right? Like that ink itself is so expensive. It's one of the most expensive liquids on earth. Why is that? Because they've designed a monopoly that hurts the consumer. So many products that are supposedly great products are in fact monopolies that are rent-seeking. You look at a lot of the Bay Area VC products, a lot of it is rent-seeking. For example, you look at taxis or you look at hotels, people that are involved in the venture capital industry take a product, they convert it to a hyper-growth product, make it worse, and then that worse product, then the prices get raised and then they rent-seek. So one of the alternatives is to essentially have this federated democratic control of institutions. So the idea here is that the key distinction from communism, which is authoritarian, terrible, lots of examples of all authoritarian regimes, whether they're fascist authoritarian or they're communist authoritarian, are terrible. You want liberty. And so the liberty is through a collective self-management, and this is corporate state domination is the opposite of this federated approach. And so the real critical difference here is it's anti-authoritarian. You reject central state control of economy and society, and you're pro-freedom. So you want individual liberties, individual human rights, bottom up as well. You want grassroots decisions. So let's take Linux, for example. Someone could say, hey, I think I want to make my own Linux distribution. Great. Well, you just take the Linux kernel, make some changes to it. And we see this. We see a proliferation of people making their own distributions of Linux. So this is really a very different, more freedom-based approach that is actually much more egalitarian and has more merit-based components to it than potentially just traditional the way things are working with big tech and monopolies. And you can think of some historical movements. In fact, the Spanish anarchist movement from 1868 to 1939 is pretty interesting because that was actually happening. Let's go ahead and take a look at the central premise of that, which is very similar, again, to open source software, is that workers should control their workplaces and their communities democratically. And so in the case of 1868 to 1939, this was the largest anarchist movement in modern history. And the CNT, or the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, this was anarcho syndicate that had a union with 1 million members. So basically, it's like a trade union where people are in solidarity working together for the common good. This does not mean communism. This does not mean authoritarianism. This means that people have a fair wage where they can negotiate and decide what kind of work they would like to do in a situation where you can have a more fair outcome. So this is more like a co-op. And we can see that, in fact, one of the downsides of this was it was so successful that, in fact, invited this fascist regime to fight it. And so in many ways, you could say the antithesis of fascism is anarchism, and anarchism isn't about destroying things or, you don't want law and order. It means that you have a democracy and more freedom, and you have a less bureaucratic system. So we can see, in fact, this isn't just some pipe dream or a theory. This is exactly the way that Linux is developed. This is exactly the way free and open source software is developed. And this is the technical embodiment of these libertarian principles in a digital infrastructure. So we can see, in fact, the key parallels. So there's decentralized authority versus hierarchical control with Windows or Apple, where there's this golden pathway and you must follow the rules. Also, there's a voluntary association of programmers. You can fork Linux, you can fork Python, you can fork Ruby, you can fork Rust. You can do anything you want. You can build your own projects. Also, there's a federation of projects with both interdependence and also interconnection. So you can choose to use someone's, Rust package, or you can use something from Python or use something from Linux, but you don't have to use it. It's really this collective ownership of the vital infrastructure has been shown to be superior to this corporate infrastructure. And the technical decision is made by the practitioners, not these executives. So how could someone who's the Microsoft CEO or the Apple CEO who's making $100 million a year, how do they actually even know what good is? They're not writing code. They're not actually doing the work with their own two hands. And so that's really why you see things like Linux being so superior to Windows, is because the people that are actually building the code are making the decisions. And really, if we look at this in a nutshell, this could potentially be a contrasting model to the current tech monopoly oligarchy structure that has surveillance capitalism built in, just like the Stasi East Germany of the 1940s until the fall of the Berlin Wall. you could make many parallels to what's currently happening in America and even globally, is that it's a manifestation of the dreams of Stasi East Germany. So you can see there's centralized decision-making by executives and shareholders. Proprietary software is a control mechanism. You can see surveillance capitalism is mass data collection, creating asymmetric power relationships. There's behavioral prediction, where products are sold to the highest bidders. There's algorithmic manipulation of user behavior, shadow profiles, extraction of behavioral surplus. AI systems are trained on unconsented data collection, so you're not asking for consent. There's artificial scarcity through IP protection. There's platform monopolies with dependent ecosystems. There's concentration of power in a few different corporations. There's prioritization of the profit extraction over community benefit. And there's also regulatory capture, because the organizations themselves are regulating themselves. So they donate to Congress, and then Congress does exactly what they tell them to do. And so in the case of the alternative, is that we already have examples of this, and it's very successful, is the libertarian-socialist tech alternative. Linux is socialism. Linux is anarchism. This is exactly the most predominant way people develop software, is libertarian socialism. And it is, in fact, absolutely about freedom. So it's user and developer autonomy is the highest value. Software freedom, the right to use, the right to study, the right to modify, the right to share. Also collaborative development across organizational boundaries. Also transparent governance and decision, knowledge sharing versus knowledge hoarding culture, which is happening in corporations. And the human beings, or human rights, are what are prioritized versus profit maximization. And I think that's one big takeaway, is that fascism, monopoly, this corporate structure of surveillance capitalism, really what it is a slow degradation of human rights that were declared in 1948 after World War II. The alternative is this libertarian socialist tech approach that we see with Linux. So really, we can even see successful versions of this even in play outside of tech. So we see that the Spanish cooperative success model is Mandragon Corporation. There's 80,000 employees across 100 cooperatives. They have democratic governance. They have salary ratios capped. For example, 6-1 in Spain versus 350-1 in a U.S. corporation. And they also have 60 years of sustained profitability. So what's going on here that they can do that, but the United States cannot? Well, it's that we can do it, but they're not allowed to do it. Also, if we look at Spanish grocery cooperatives, we see many examples of that as well. Like there's some that have millions of consumer members and 16,000 plus worker owners, and they have lower prices for consumers and better conditions for workers. And we can see that the key success factors are federated structure, so it's local autonomy plus shared services, intercooperation, also education, democratic mechanisms so you can respond to change, and then the capital is subordinated to labor, not vice versa. And then finally, to wrap things up here, as we really dive into how we could continue to improve on this, is that we can look at social media, which has been very destructive at spreading misinformation. So one of the approaches could be federated social media, Mastodon or ActivityPub or Bluesky, also community-owned networks. And we can see this with mesh networks or municipal broadband, also with community-owned data like Wikipedia, platform cooperatives, also free software foundation like GNU, also peer production communities as well. So Wikipedia, again, is a strong candidate here. Debian is a good democratic governance structure. Also commons-based resources. So instead of abusing the commons, we have a Creative Commons and open data, and you have privacy-focused alternatives to surveillance capitalism. Signal for secure messaging, Proton Mail for encrypted email, Brave for privacy, DuckDuckGo for non-track search. So really, as you dive into some of the real dystopian things that are happening in America, it isn't like there are not alternatives that are essentially a way out, right? And one of the ways to think about it is to figure out how to use as many of these existing free and open libertarian tech projects as you can, and spend your time dedicating resources to it, using the resources, promoting these resources, and also, if you can, using business models that support people versus supporting these oligarchs. And I think this is a moment in history where we really can maybe think through some of the problems that have happened with the traditional structure in America, and also look at potentially some, next steps, like how could you support these alternative technology visions, or look at the human-centered democratically controlled technology. These are some of the things to think about, and it isn't some straw man that you put up and you say, if we have free software, it's communism. In fact, I remember hearing that when I was at Caltech. Someone told me, when we were talking about Windows versus Linux, this was, I think, around 2000, is that Linux is communism. It's just false. In fact, not only is it not communism, it's in fact the opposite. It's a non-authoritarian operating system that's free, that has powered the global infrastructure. So really what we could think about is this illegal monopoly with big tech actually restricting the growth of technology, restricting the freedom of people? And can we have an alternative to it, which is looking at libertarian socialism and looking at the tech models that are identical to it, like Linux and open source software, as a way to find a path out of the dystopian monopoly and also big tech oligarchy that America is in 2025?